Hi, I'm Mark Reed. Follow me as I attempt to put my new book, Impact Culture, into practice and discuss it with others taking a similar journey. You'll get tips that will help you achieve more impact from your research and stay healthy, no matter how busy you are. Rediscover your purpose. Lead from behind to empower those around you. Transform your work culture. Welcome to Season 4 of the Fast Track Impact Podcast. Okay, so this week we are having a think about some of the negative, unintended consequences of this whole impact thing and what we might be able to do to avoid some of the things that can go wrong when we try to have a benefit for our stakeholders, for the world. And I want to think about this in particular in relation to the REF results which have just come out. This is being recorded just prior to the results coming out, but interested to have a think about impact through the lens of the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. Which is arguably driving a lot of the impact activity for good and for ill. And to do this, I am privileged to be joined today by Professor Gemma Derrick, who is a Professor of Higher Education at the University of Bristol. And she was with us a few weeks ago in one of the Community of Practice sessions talking about this work and discussing this with many of you. But this is my chance to get to go a bit deeper and to share this conversation with you guys as well. So, Gemma, welcome to the podcast. It's fantastic to have you with us today. And tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on, first of all, this whole idea that we can assess impact and in so doing drive impact. And whether the cost in terms of the negative unintended consequences of this is actually worth it.
Oh, goodness. Let's start off with the easy question then, shall we? Thanks so much, Mark. It's absolutely fantastic to be here with you. I think when we talk about the things like the REF driving impact, I think that we need to acknowledge the hidden cost or the hidden aspect of impact that drives the whole conceptualization of grimpact, which is the fact that there's always an assumption that the impact from research has to be good. It has to have a benefit. It has to have, good outcomes for society, and that's how you prove its worth. But research and knowledge production in more generally speaking, it's constantly evolving and it's constantly gaining and losing value. And I think that what started this whole piece of research is the understanding that this benefit or this bias toward positivity was embedded and completely implicit within all definitions of impact beyond academia. And we, as a research group, because we started this as part of a large collaborative project with my late colleague Paul Benneworth as well, we acknowledged that, this implicit bias towards positivity was perhaps, only showing half of the story, and by only showing half of the story, we neglected to really, embrace the wider impact that research can have on our society, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So that's what drove it too. So the idea that, you can drive impact. If you want to buy into the idea that you can drive impact, then you also need to accept that in the future at some point, as research evolves and gains and loses value, that you are going to have inevitably a grimpact as well. So we wanted to look at the reasoning why grimpact occurs.
Yeah, so this term grimpact, you haven't misheard, Gemma. This is a term that you coined in a paper. I'll put a link to the paper into the show notes so you can read that in more depth. But yeah, I think this is a really important concept. I think even from that kind of point of definition, what actually is impact and this implicit bias. I looked at definitions of impact from across academic and non-academic publications and found exactly that same bias. And so the definition that I published in my research policy paper last year was about, yes, demonstrable and perceptible. Perception matters. And actually, when you bring perception into this, this becomes a whole lot more subjective, and we realize that there are a whole lot of value judgments here. And what might be good to one person in one place, in one context, could be the opposite of good and very bad in other contexts. But many of the negative unintended consequences you've looked at are arguably just bad. These are things that have gone badly wrong, and that if we could understand what is the anatomy of a grimpact and the factors that lead up to this and cause this, might we be able to predict ahead of time and crucially avoid these? So tell us a bit more about the concept of grimpact, how you're defining this, and these causal factors. And maybe a bit more about the research itself in terms of how you've actually defined these in relation to various real-world examples.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I think that the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge that grimpact, or the definition of grimpact, is fluid, and that's something that through our research we're trying to pin down by conceptualizing the factors that contribute to grimpact. I mean, we have to acknowledge, and I think most of your listeners will agree, that impact is something that exists beyond the REF definition, or the Research Excellence Framework definition in the UK. And that's where grimpact exists. Grimpact exists beyond these definitions used primarily for research evaluation purposes. Because research evaluation, as the past research has shown, is looked at to reward research. It's used to incentivize research. So it is understandable that impact that is, submitted to these exercises will have an implicit positivity associated with them. But grimpact is when things go wrong. So grimpact is not just negative impact. I think that's a little bit too simplistic to see it as negative impact. But really what grimpact is the perfect storm of different components that involve things like miscommunication between researchers and stakeholders, loss of control of research as it evolved and is used and utilized by other stakeholders other than the ones that were initially envisaged by the researchers at the beginning of the project. I think it's also, misconduct, academic misconduct comes through there in a little while as well as the idea that the expectations about what the research will do doesn't necessarily meet up with the reality of what the research has done, and not being able to acknowledge that. So I think that when we talk about how we learn to define research or how we learn to define grimpact, I think we need to acknowledge some of the methodology that we did. So what we did is we took the assumption that grimpact is something that can really only be envisaged in hindsight. So we chose 3 very obvious case studies, and we did what's called a vertical case study analysis, where we looked at the facts of the case and started to categorizing the effects or the impacts or the grimpacts. And when we see impact, we're even broader than a REF definition. We'd respect any influence that this piece of research had on society. So we chose 3 case studies. The first one was the MMR vaccine debate with Andrew Wakefield, with the original Lancet paper published in 2005, I think. And then there was the second case study was Cambridge Analytica, which was a far more recent case study, but something that was very dynamic and had interesting long-range impacts on society beyond academia. And the third case study was the debates, or the economics debates, used to underpin the financial crisis in 2008, and we just kind of looked at the characteristics associated with that decision making, and the assumptions that were assumed during that during that period, and how that contributed to grimpact. And we systematically mapped the effects as we found them. And we really were tuned on to looking at commonalities between these case studies to see what characteristics were very much, characteristic of a grimpact, because we assumed that all these 3 case studies were a grimpact. And we found a number of different characteristics which led to this definition of grimpact that I previously said. And they were a sense of academic misconduct, a lack of control, an attribution error. Who's to blame? Is it the researchers? Is it just something out of control? And the third one third way, that lack of control we called the contagion, but the third way is we said a violation of normal impact. And normal impact is the impact that we include in our ref case studies. These are the ones have good stories between responsible relationships between civil organisations and researchers, and somehow grimpact was a violation of this arrangement at the time. So these were the 4 characteristics that we came up. And can I just say, we're finding new characteristics as we go forward too, because like all research, this grimpact study isn't something that has an end date. It's something that we continue to evolve over time, especially when the ref results come out. So that will be exciting.
Yeah, I wonder if I can dig in on one of these that you've been talking about, this loss of control, and then it begs the question: loss of control for whom? And if you look at say the Cambridge Analytica case, for example, even some of the groups who were benefiting from misinformation around MMR and such like, by taking control of the public debate based on that research, or the tools that were provided through Cambridge Analytica. They clearly benefited. So there were political benefits, benefits for particular ideologies. And so we might look in at some of those ideologies and find that very problematic based on our values, and yet for those who were passionate about getting Donald Trump elected or whatever it might have been, this was a benefit for them, and supposedly a legitimate use of these tools. So, to what extent do you have to have many of these factors present? Because it's only when you then layer into something like this the various forms of misconduct, misuse of data, etc., that we can quite clearly categorise this as grimpact. Otherwise, couldn't you argue, well, it's still in the eye of the beholder? It depends on your values and on your position in that debate.
Yeah, well, I guess the fact is that we kind of don't take an ideological stance when it comes to examining these things, which is why we chose the case study approach that we did, because we understand that, it might have had one person's grimpact might be another person's impact, and we realized that. And we were really interested in looking at commonalities between the 3 case studies. So these are not, things that we cherry picked out of the air. They were common across all of it. The loss of control is really important. And the reason why the loss of control is really important is not necessarily ideologically based, is that grimpact is contagious. It acts fast, and it acts fast between a combination of factors. There is the desire for us to communicate our results or from research to a lay audience, which basically puts it into an audience or a discussion area that we have no control over. And so that when it is introduced into that section, there's always a risk that it's going to be co-opted for ideas or for things that weren't intended. So there's always this danger, and the lack of control was very important because we saw those in all of our case studies. For better or for worse, was not the focus of our analysis, the fact that it lost control once it was disseminated within the public. And I think this is something that's perhaps not necessarily acknowledged when we talk about impact, as opposed to a wider definition of impact, which includes grimpact. And this is the idea that, in a way, having a plan towards impact, so the pathways to impact statements we used to do for the SRC, the AHRC grants or the Research Council grants, and now embedding it into our research. In a way, they're futile because, you can have a plan, and if everything goes to plan, then yay, you get an impact. It does reinforce the idea that grimpact is something that can be controlled, that can be planned, that can be pushed. And all these things are, to a certain extent, true towards guaranteeing impact. But on the way, there are, ways in which your research is used beyond that plan. And if we aren't open to it, then we are not open to stopping it before it happens. And that's where grimpact occurs. So we argued in our paper that the rush to gain impact to the rush towards accepting linear conceptualization as impact as something that, is a product of good planning that we have to do before we even start the research, in a way creates a narrow-mindedness about how impact occurs, which is blind to the risk for grimpact. And we have to call it the risk for grimpact, because not every piece of research is going to have a grimpact. Some of them might not. They can only do wonderful things, and bravo to them. But knowledge is fluid. Knowledge is adopted by many different people. It transformed, and it's sometimes transformed beyond the person who created it in the first place. And so that is where grimpact occurs, or where the risk for grimpact is higher. And what we did by identifying these 4 characteristics of grimpact, that's the violation of normal impact, the attribution or questions about who to blame, grimpact is contagious, as well as it's due partially to a transgression on misconduct, is identify and characterize and be able to identify the situations where the risk for grimpact is higher for a researcher. We don't want our research to have a negative influence, but evaluation means that these negative influences don't necessarily have a negative value for you as a researcher, because you can't be to blame, but it does send an argument that the only impact that we should be monitoring are those ones that have a positive output or a benefit. And this is a problem when we come to research evaluation and research management, because we need to be open to the unknown and the unexpected as well.
So I agree when it comes to evaluation. I think we need to shift much more from summative to formative when it comes to evaluation, and to use a much more holistic evaluation framework to look for the things that went well, things that didn't go well from different perspectives, so that we can learn, so that we can apologize if things didn't go well. And in my experience, it's actually when I'm doing an evaluation, it's only when I actually explicitly ask, is there anything we could have done better, that people then start to say, well, actually. And that is the point where you need to, first of all, apologize, but secondly, work out what could we do to reverse, to make better, or at least to prevent that stuff from happening again.
Yeah, I think the idea that impact is something that occurs as a result of this plan, and is something that happens independent, and it's something that has a start, so when you do the research, and an end, means that we are blind to the way that research can evolve, and also the learning opportunities we have as researchers, as research managers, as institutions, as policymakers, the opportunity we have to learn from our mistakes, because mistakes will happen, towards a greater understanding of what grimpact is in the future. I think that would be a missed opportunity if we were completely blind to grimpact moving forward.
Yeah, totally. I do wonder if we have a difference of opinion, though, when it comes to the role of planning impact, when it comes to avoiding these kinds of grimpacts. So I guess the question that I want to ask you, and see how you go with this, maybe we are on the same page after all, but how can we, as researchers, do our best to avoid grimpacts before they happen? Now, I know you took a retrospective approach, but based on your research, what are some of the key things that we can do as researchers to prevent this stuff from happening proactively at the outset?
Oh, well, I would definitely agree with you for a plan. I mean, I like a good plan, and a plan is essential. And being a plan is a good exercise for us to go about what the value of our research might have, who would be interested. People do the same sort of things in risk assessments for technologies. And so it's very similar for impact going forward. A good plan
should actually have a risk assessment built into it. What are your risks? What are your assumptions? What could go wrong? How can we mitigate them? And certainly the fast track impact planning template builds that in. So I think that's essential, and it also will increase your likelihood of getting funding if you can think of the risks before your reviewers actually point them out, and then you get your funding and you manage for those risks. And just simply asking that question as part of the impact planning process, I think, can be hugely valuable.
I think that's exactly what you need. I think the way that impact is being evaluated at the moment is independent of that kind of risk assessment, which I think is a vital exercise. And I'm glad that you have built that into your formats as well. What I'm thinking about how grimpact can be avoided. One of the characteristics of grimpact was this violation of normal impact, which is basically the communications that happen between researchers who produce the knowledge and stakeholders who use the knowledge. And sometimes it's a little bit of when there's a mismatch between expectations about ownership of the research, ownership of the narrative research as it evolves, and the ability for individuals and institutions to correct themselves when new information appears that contradicts previous beliefs. And so when we talk about what can be avoided, the most important aspects to avoid grimpact from our research would be to make sure that those communication channels between researchers and stakeholders are continually open, and that stakeholders are aware that knowledge changes and that perhaps they need to be a little bit more agile and flexible to change their position or their use of the information as new knowledge expands. But the other thing is that...
If I can interrupt briefly, and the other issue is stakeholders change as well, and you need to be aware enough of your changing stakeholder landscape.
Yeah, but then you get into difficult situations. Yeah, but then you get into a difficult situation where the stakeholders' needs should not be what drives the research. You would like to think that research exists beyond just stakeholder needs, and that stakeholder needs are about using it. So I don't want to go into research saying I have to prove X equals to Y. I'm going to go in and investigate X, and if it has an effect on Y, that's great. But the stakeholder needs shouldn't necessarily be involved in that. And I think this is where misconduct issue characterization of grimpact comes into play as well. What happens also is that stakeholders need to be aware of the restrictions that academics work within, and the restrictions of their role, the expectation, the norms of academic culture. And when those two things collide, when they have an expectation that researchers will do X that researchers don't understand. Researchers need to publish their work. They need to promote their work. There's very little room in there for the idea that there's privacy or confidentiality or intellectual property debates within that kind of culture. And there's always a mismatch here. So this transgressions about, which was another characteristics of impact, the transgressions on academic conduct, when the expectations about entrepreneurialism and non-academic needs clashed with the norms that academics themselves feel implicitly in themselves, but also the norms in which they have to act. So when there was a miscommunication between these two things, that's when the risk for grimpact increased. And I think a lot of the research that we see on knowledge use look at how researchers kind of need to somehow translate their research to stakeholders. So they need to somehow mold themselves into the needs of stakeholders. And there's very little researches where stakeholders need to be aware and mold themselves to the norms and needs of academics and research too. And when those two things clash, the risk for grimpact is higher.
Fascinating. This is not a way that I tend to think about research, and you're kind of opening my own mind to what does that look like, and what do we need to do to make our stakeholders more aware of the research process, the ethics and norms within that process, and enable them to be part of the ethical and rigorous process that is research. And yet I can see this working in different ways in different contexts. So I totally agree with you when that comes to, say, political influence. I'm doing research that is designed to answer a particular policy problem, and my policy customer perhaps likes what I've done to start with, but then there's a change of government halfway through the project, and all of a sudden now this is going towards the wrong objective, and now they want me to change what I'm doing. Well, sorry, that's not how it works.
Yeah, it's like I want, it's you can't. Research should see something that exists beyond, political or ideological beliefs, because it is about the pursuit of knowledge and the creation of new knowledge. And that's not to say that knowledge exists in a completely socially in a vacuum and it's not sensitive to those sorts of things. It is. but the fact that, stakeholders should, put in an order for what results they want and expect that to come out, and they'll use that regardless, with all the, the tips and the branding that comes with the idea of objective academic research, is an unrealistic expectation.
And yet, at the same time, I've done work, community research in Africa, and I've seen things changing in terms of new contexts, things changing over time, where actually I feel like there is a moral responsibility of the researcher to understand these things. So I don't know, a community that changes composition, is a huge influx of migrants, a new kind of social group that kind of moves in, and actually as a community now, you've got a whole load of people who have very different views, very different needs, and potentially quite acute needs. Do you just force on and help the former elites, despite the fact that there are now these very new, different groups with very important needs? Or the other thing I've seen on a very regular basis is just the problem that you set out to try and solve with that community gets superseded by something which is just way, way bigger and more important, and nobody's interested in the thing you were originally researching. And to what extent does it can just feel awkward, but is it right to just carry on regardless of the fact that nobody's interested in this anymore, and you're actually wasting their time because they are just trying to survive now, given what has happened to them, and I think you do have to adapt, and that isn't, in those cases, that's not ideologically driven. Well, maybe my belief in prioritizing the needs of the poor and the oppressed are, but I think, I don't know, maybe that is okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And within the case studies that I saw, that kind of nuanced responsibility to stakeholders wasn't included. So perhaps that's something you have to include. But I think that your example really spells out my original point about what you need to do to reduce the risk of grimpact. And clear, concise, ongoing dialogue between stakeholders and researchers from the outset is very important for reducing the risk of grimpact.
Yeah. And all the way through, totally, yeah. So related to this then, I wonder if I can unpack the Cambridge Analytica case, because this really rocked my boat at the time. And I just couldn't believe that this was not making headlines for weeks. There was a few, other than Channel 4 News, Observer, Guardian, it kind of was like, there's an issue, and then it kind of all blew over. And I kind of stayed with the story and watched it develop and was just more and more horrified. And I remember at the time I went back and I read the original paper. It was 2011, 12, 13, something like that. And it was actually won Paper of the Year in the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences. And the thing that disturbed me most was reading this paper. I got to the conclusion of the paper, and the authors basically predicted what had happened and said, they put this health warning at the end and said, in the wrong hands, these tools could be used to manipulate populations, elections, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, so what do you do in this situation? These people clearly were aware of the risks. They published open access, as we should, pointing out those risks, and as a result, pretty much gave this gift. So here's a good idea to a bunch of people who read the paper, and so that really got me thinking. Well, what on earth can you do? So you've made a plan, you've identified the risks, but that still is the problem. And for me, the key issue was the way in which that group lost control. And I think there were some key mistakes that they made in terms of how they gave control to people that they perhaps shouldn't have done. And also, obviously, some fairly major ethical questions around the data that they used to power their work. But putting that aside, my sense was that had they decided, this is high risk enough that we need to keep control over this, perhaps then they could have spun this out in a very different way that would have retained much more control for the researchers, that would have then enable them to manage that risk given what they had identified. And I wonder whether actually this impact planning process where you identify a risk that big has to then build in mitigations that are designed to retain control. And even if the researcher themselves has no interest in leading a spin-out company, that may be something that universities need to look at to say, well, yeah, we need to make sure, because ultimately Cambridge University got brought into this, and this was their reputation on the line as well then.
Okay, well, first things first, disclaimer, knowledge for knowledge's sake, it was a stunning paper. It was stunning. Like, I read it, just went, wow, like you look at some people's minds and you're like, that's just brilliant.
Yeah,
evil.
I got that brilliant. As well.
Yeah, it was brilliant. So that aside, I mean, this is another characteristic of grimpact that we saw that was difficult to navigate within the impact evaluation discourse, and that is who is to blame. And as you pointed out, at the end of the paper, the authors said this could be used to manipulate elections and all of this sort of stuff, which is a genre of writing that we all have to do for every academic paper. We have to say, how can this be used in the future? So for the researchers' point of view, they had done their due diligence by saying that it could have like this impact somewhere, but by putting that warning, it's like, protect with care at the end. But by putting that warning, line at the end of the paper, the researchers felt they had done their due diligence, they had done their role, and that anything that happened beyond that, convention of putting in a warning about what this could potentially doing at the end of an academic paper, that despite being open access, no one reads except you and I perhaps, and everyone else who loves a paper. They'd already done their role. Yeah. So anything that happened beyond that was not their fault. Right? And so to require them to put a plan about why this research might be dangerous in the future, it can be seen as futile if it never eventuates to anything, because sometimes it just never eventuates to anything. It was the right situation at the right time, and there's a lot of research about, the context to create, new knowledge or have impact. We can go down Kingdom's parallel streams if you want to, but we're not doing that. But for the researchers, they had done their role and it finished there. To ask them to put a plan in contact for the future is, even by current conventions, coming out Ref 2222 results coming out with impact, is beyond the normal role that a researcher, for research's sake, needs to participate in. So asking them to do something, asking them to put a plan together for something that may or may not happen is perhaps, unrealistic expectations, unless that becomes more general for everyone to do. But we've also got to understand that these researchers are practices and research culture which is overworked, underpaid, and completely, based on free labor in a way, and we can go into that too. But the idea that they have to do extra works beyond what is normally expected from them, they just wanted a publication, that's it, is one of the problems. So one of the problems and one of the risk factors for grimpact. So I'm not advocating that we have to do that. I'm just highlighting the tensions that there exists within academic culture between who is to blame and where does a researcher's role end, so that they are not necessarily responsible for what comes afterwards. The way that we conceptualize impact for research evaluation purposes now is about creating a case study where there's a piece of research and then we map, what goes on in the future, and that comes back to reward us. But we don't do that for grimpact, and research is something that we can only, map benefits for, we can have individual reward. We don't do that for grimpact because perhaps it's not the best political tool to say what bad things research has produced. But again, it's very difficult to change convention around how we evaluate things and how we, produce an objective evaluation of impact/grimpact into the future. But yeah, I mean, who is to blame is one thing that I highlighted the characteristic, but I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is. There is an argument about, research continues to gain value into the future. It loses value in the future. After 100 years, when do we stop? Can we blame Einstein for the nuclear bomb? I mean, so where does it stop and where does it end? And convention at the moment within research culture means that if you put that disclaimer at the end of the paper, your job is done. And so
I would argue that it is each of us, it's our individual responsibility to do that moral thinking and ask ourselves, where does our role end? And for some of us, we can go with that convention and say, great, job done. I'm okay with that. But at the same time, I think we need to understand what the options are if we want to stay with our impacts, because my experience is that impact only matures and grows over time. And if you're on a negative trajectory, then your grimpact typically snowballs, as you've said, very rapidly over time often. And so
you can have more than one line, Mark. You can have one line where impact is increasing in one area and used by one group, but you can have a parallel line that's going in the opposite direction if it's being used to other purposes with another group. So
yes, and how do we keep track of that? Yeah, nightmare. Yeah, so I use stakeholder analysis to try and tackle some of these kinds of issues. And I wonder what you think about this, Gemma, and feel free to be critical here, because maybe this is a great practical idea. It works for me. Maybe it's a bit manipulative. And I guess listeners will make their own mind up about this. But I think we need to decide at what point our responsibility ends. And if we want to stay with this, stakeholder analysis is quite a nice way to identify these dual, maybe multiple tracks that our impact might take. And so what I'm doing is at the outset of a project, we're identifying who has a stake in the various different outcomes from this research. And depending on what the research ends up saying, I don't know at this point, it may play into one of at least two different camps who are in conflict with each other. So if we get one output, then we've got one group of people who are really happy and the other group are really upset, or vice versa. And so this is for me about then talking to these people, understanding their perspectives, and building a pathway to impact that can work for both of those groups, as well as a risk mitigation plan for both of those groups, depending on whether it goes their way or not. And as long as you can keep both groups engaged with the research and give them early access to your findings to give them a sense of, look, it looks like it's going your way or against your way, then two quite nice things happen. The first is that I get early feedback on this, and the people who don't like my research will often give me critical feedback. And in some cases, actually, you're right, maybe we could do better. And if that's how you're going to discredit the research and claim this doesn't apply and you're not going to do anything about it, well, let's go and actually have a look at some of those things that you're saying and find out if indeed there is any truth in them. And as a result, we do better research. And where that's not something I can research, it's more of an ideological thing. At least I'm flushing out now the arguments they're going to use to try and delegitimize and undermine my research, so I can prepare for that as well. And at the end of the day, I've worked with them closely enough that, we're going to publish our work, but you're not getting blindsided and having huge negative impacts. You've got time to prepare. I'm working with you to mitigate those risks to your interests. And as a result, those people for whom the research goes against them say, you were fair, you were even-handed, it was all transparent, and we still trust you, and we'll continue to work with you in future, even although this project didn't go our way. Meantime, you're working in parallel with the other group for whom it did go their way, and you're powering towards those impacts that you planned at the outset. And my sense is that this can then give us a very practical way of trying to get a sense of what the impacts and grimpacts might be from different perspectives at the outset, but then keeping an eye on this and managing this with those different groups all the way through so that we can keep things friendly, build trust, but also be able to neutralize some of the most negative feedback that might be ideologically driven to try and undermine what we're doing.
Okay, I think there's one problem here with this whole idea, which I think is great, but there's one issue that perhaps needs to be resolved, and that's that's the fact that you're assuming that perhaps we know who the stakeholders are at the beginning, so you can involve them. And there is the idea that perhaps because research and research impact is, as we know, serendipitous, what about the stakeholders we haven't yet envisaged yet? How do we capture them and get them involved? The thing about grimpact is the contagion aspect, which means that it is co-opted by other groups really quickly for their own purposes. They might not necessarily be so easily mappable, nor open to conversation about how they're using the research in an objective way, nor talking to the researchers who might contribute information that goes against what they want to use the information for. So I think it's really interesting, but again, you assume that you already know who the stakeholders are, that again, stakeholders are this dialogue is something that the stakeholders are open to in the first place, and that the stakeholders are easily mappable and identifiable, and it might not necessarily be the case. One of the things that we saw in the Cambridge Analytica cases and also the MMR vaccine case is that it was co-opted by groups that are not necessarily trackable through your normal routes. So they use research I'm talking mainly through social media, and there's some really interesting research about how in social media, if you come into a group that's tweeting the same things like anti-vaccine rhetoric, for example, and you come in with a piece of information that rejects or completely undermines the basis of which people are finding information, that they will reject it as true, and therefore you won't be able to have the impact there. So the idea that a researcher who did the paper can come into an anti-vaccine group and say, well, sorry guys, but you're using it wrong and that's not what I said, and for them to listen and then change is perhaps one of the problems of that kind of analysis. So not all stakeholders are amenable to being so reflective or of the use of their research for their own ideological gains. And I think that's one of the problems. I think but you can do that with some stakeholders. And again, maintaining a dialogue is something that I say should happen. And I've just said that perhaps that's not possible.
Yeah, I think both are true, aren't they? We can But
and also, you have to understand that as society evolves and changes, and as we go through, life, the context in which we view results changes, and sometimes that happens very quickly. Sometimes that's completely unpredictable. Who saw that there was a pandemic happening, for example? So it's very difficult to be able to foresee these kinds of things in order to engage in a meaningful stakeholder analysis. But this is one of the things that raises the risk that increases the risk that grimpact will occur. Is the way that which, but again, one of the things that I say is that the longer grimpact goes unchecked in evaluation processes, the more likely it is proliferate and perhaps, work against the reputation that research is so desperately trying to build with society by using impact as advantages of how they can benefit society. But if these things go unchecked, then it looks as if research is not trying to engage in its mistakes or engage with its mistakes in a way that, can admit, we got it wrong, or maybe that wasn't what it was intended, on those kinds of dialogues that pushes the debate forward. And by doing so, reestablishes and reaffirms the trust relationship that is necessary between science and research and society within a civil science partnership. That's extremely important as well. So the longer we let grimpact proliferate unchecked, the more likelihood that trust will break down. And that's unfortunate. It's not good for anyone.
And if you're looking for an easy way out, the sad news is, I think what we're both saying is you need to get involved, you need to get engaged, you need to find out what's going on, and get your hands dirty.
And take responsibility, no matter how painful it is.
Yeah. So obviously lots more to study in this area. I know this is just one of many diverse strands of research you're working on at the moment, Gemma, but what are your plans, just to conclude, for this line of research? What are you working on now?
Well, now that I'm at the University of Bristol, what we're working towards is setting up a grimpact repository, actually, and that is creating, at the moment, the research that I talked about here was only based on 3 case studies. And the more case studies that we can gather, the more likely it is that we can understand, the characteristics that make grimpact more likely and be able to anticipate them, build them into evaluation networks, stop grimpact proliferating, and also put researchers back in charge of their research, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the grimpact repository is something that we're working on to establish within the next 12 months. And I really do encourage everybody who's listening, please do get in contact with us. If you have an example, if you want to get in contact with the research, please do get in contact with me. Grimpact is something that we as a community need to take ownership and responsibility for. And to that end, it's important that as many people who are interested in mapping and understanding the grimpact are as involved as possible and as that they want to do. So please do get in contact with us.
Fantastic. I will give this some thought myself and put out my feelers, because it's such an important issue. So great to hear that you're doing this. Gemma, it has been a pleasure. This was more than I was expecting. I loved the session that you did for us a few weeks ago. But yeah, to have the privilege of getting to have this one-to-one with you and to go into this depth, it's been enthralling. And I hope everyone else has found it just as interesting. Gemma, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks so much. Absolute pleasure to talk to you as always. Thank you.